Good, so let's organize ourselves a little bit. What will happen is we're going to have a discussion down here for about 30, 40 minutes. And then we're going to open it up for questions. As you're listening to us discussing, what I recommend is that you just write down questions and thoughts so that when we're going to have Q&A with the panelists here, you're going to be able to ask those questions. And I have to ask you to come down here when you're going to ask your questions in the Q&A section, okay? For the panelists, what's going to happen is I have a couple of questions. I would encourage the panelists to follow up on some of the answers that you hear from the panel so that we start a discussion rather than just sequentially go through their answers. What I have to say, I guess, about my role here is, you know, when the person putting the microphones on us did so, it just felt like Dancing with the Stars or one of those shows. And whenever I give lectures with this thing on, I just feel like Dancing with the Stars. But actually, now in this context, I think it's the closest that I'll get to Dancing with the Stars. We have 3 amazing panelists here. I'm going to very quickly introduce them. I think on your programs you have a description of their work. To my right is Liat Yariv, who comes from us as a visiting professor from Caltech. She's going to be here for the year. Professor of economics at Caltech. Roland Benapou is a professor of economics here at Princeton, jointly appointed with Woodrow Wilson. And then further to the right, we have Debbie Prentice, who's the Dean of Faculty. She has a joint appointment between psychology and Woodrow Wilson, a psychologist. Okay? So I want to start this discussion by also saying that the role that I'll play for this discussion is very much inspired by dancing with my wife. My principle, what I drew from the times that I dance with my wife is don't interfere. Just let Dora shine. So I'm going to take that principle, I'm going to apply it here. I'm going to ask questions. I'm going to have a couple of follow-up questions. And hopefully we'll get a discussion going. But the principle is do not interfere. Okay, so I want to start with this question. And the focus is on the name of the center, which is KAHNEMAN Center for Behavioral Science and Public Policy. So my question to the panelists is focusing on behavioral science and public policy, maybe reframing it a little bit, behavioral science for public policy, from your perspective, from the perspective of your particular discipline, experimental economics, theoretical economics, psychology. How do you see the relevance of behavioral science for public policy? And then in order to kind of maximize information production on the panel, what is, in your opinion, one element of the type of scientific investigation that you're engaged in that makes it particularly relevant for the integration into policy? We're going to start. We actually didn't decide in advance. Whoever wants to start the question, just go ahead and then we'll.
This is called diffusion of responsibility. I think you need to sign.
Everybody looks to the right, but there's no one to your right.
Okay, I'll start. Thank you, Aline, and thank you, Eldar, and thank you all for being here. This is despite the somewhat somber news on our dignitaries. This is a wonderful event, nonetheless. So what's the relevance of psychology in particular to public policy? I mean, psychologists, we've always thought that we were central to public policy and have just wondered why policymakers didn't see it the same way. We always thought that the work we were doing, that understanding the way the mind works and the way behavior follows from the workings of the mind would be key to understanding policy. And we're so glad that the world has come around to our point of view. I actually think that I think that a lot of the blame for why people didn't pay a lot of attention to psychology and policymakers didn't pay a lot of attention to psychologists rests with psychologists and the particular norms of the field, the way that we conducted our research, and in particular the the tendency psychologists had to restrict their investigations to the laboratory where we could get the most experimental control and not, in fact, make the translation to the real world circumstances that we were sure our laboratory studies were capturing. So there are really at least three elements of policymaking that psychology informs, the design of policy, and I think Danny's work in particular, the work described in his book, Thinking Fast and Slow, is a perfect example of how an understanding of the extent to which people go through their lives using System 1 processing needs to inform the way we design our policies so that they'll be maximally effective. Implementation of policy obviously involves pitching it to people, presenting options to people, posing questions to people that they're able to answer. So understanding the way they process information, understanding the kinds of questions they can address, understanding the ways in which different kinds of levers motivate or fail to motivate behavior is key. But then, and non-trivially, I think, and this is my one way in which my discipline probably should affect an understanding of policy making more, is policies require support to be enacted. And framing policies and messaging around policies to gain their public support, choosing policy topics that, in fact, one can gain support for, that will be effective in changing behavior in positive ways, I think it's another area where the huge literature in psychology on persuasion and the ways in which you change people's minds and in order to change their behavior has a large role to play, and one that I think so far has been underexploited.
All right, maybe I'll go next. Do you want to answer the two parts of your question separately or together?
However you prefer, Roland.
All right, okay. So let me first say a few words on what you started with, which was the science and policy. I mean, obviously, policy should ideally be based on the best science. It isn't always, and you know, political psychology, behavioral economics, sociology, behavioral science in general have things to say about why that is as well. But you know, clearly that is one reason why we have this link between science and policy. At the same time, you know, science is also science per se, and doesn't necessarily have to always be connected to policy. It turns out that very often in the long run, in all the disciplines, it eventually impacts policy, but those lags can be long and variable. Now, in terms of economics, or especially theoretical economics, as part of this big umbrella of behavioral science that's bringing us together, there are many well-known domains in which there have been valuable feedbacks which then have policy implications. So I'll just mention a couple. Obviously, you know, loss aversion, which Danny has been clearly associated with, is very important and has implications for obvious things such as choice under risk and then financial markets, but also maybe less obvious things such as bargaining and the structure of contracts. And so those are, you know, applications that are being worked out by theorists. Another one would be social preferences, altruism, reciprocity, etc. So again, these are things that are being incorporated into economic thinking, economic models, that is more than one person at the same time, the whole society perhaps, where there are some people who are reciprocators, people who are not, and then this turn has implications for public goods provision, the existence of an NGO sector, wage differentials between that sector and others, and so on. And a third one would be self-control problems or temptation problems with obvious implications for savings policy of various types. So those are just three examples of how there's this feedback between psychology, economics, experiments, theory, with ultimate policy implications. And then maybe I'll talk later about the ones that I'm involved in.
Okay, so maybe I'll say something about experimental economics, since that's much of what I do. I think a lot of experiments historically have focused on individual behavior and kind of identifying weird stuff that people do. And that's a lot of the things that Eldar just mentioned. I think experiments are an incredibly useful tool for studying policy. It's essentially a cheap way to try out policy. So let me just give you a few examples. Suppose that you're contemplating banning electoral polls for whatever reasons. We have some models that suggest this might be a good idea. You could try to change policy, and maybe that's useful, but that's very costly. Whereas in the lab, I have to pay 200 subjects. It costs about as much as my car, but it's not too bad, and you get a lot of insights. Similarly, if you thought about mandating participation in elections, that would, again, be a very costly experiment to run in reality, but very cheap in the lab. If we thought about affirmative action, again, this is an example where the lab can be extremely useful. So I think experiments are now becoming more and more of a tool, not just to identify how people behave, but also how it interacts with different policy instruments. And I can say something on theory after we rotate.
So let me quickly follow up on that thought. As I'm an assistant professor, putting together a research program, when you guys started your careers, were you aware of the public policy implications that your research had? Or was it more like you discovered them later on? There were certain pressures from institutions that hired you to go in the direction of intervention policy. So I was just curious about your thoughts on that. Whoever wants to take the question.
Everybody looks at me. I did not start out thinking that I was going to have anything to do with a policy school. This was a wonderful opportunity that came along later. I thought I was going to understand the way people's minds worked. And what I discovered actually was that, in fact, I could pursue the questions I wanted to about the way people's minds worked and see the relevance of it for policy. So I think I think most of us start out as creatures of our disciplines, and it's only as policymakers have had more truck and trade with the thinkers that we've, some of us have been pulled into this kind of area.
Mm-hmm. Same for you? Well, my experience is I was doing ecologically valid work. That is, the stimulus materials were very similar to what people encounter in the real world. And then being hired here at Princeton and doing the joint appointment in the public policy school, there was this pressure to make my work even more policy relevant. So, and interactions with colleagues, it puts you in some sort of a scaffold that orients you one way or the other. And my research program has become, therefore, a little bit more policy oriented compared to when I started. Did you guys find that trajectory as well? Or?
Well, I started as a math geek, and I'm still surrounded by geeks, so it's not that the institution forces this upon me, but I've always been interested in people and the realization that sometimes people do weird things, and sometimes these weird things are not necessarily what's best for them, even from their own original perspective, naturally leads you to think of what might help. So I think I very quickly got interested in political economy and in different instruments that might assist people in thinking about when these instruments might in fact help or might hurt.
It's a little similar. I started doing kind of straight economics, having to do with inflation, et cetera, but I've always been interested in social issues, how groups of people behave, et cetera. So after a while, I found myself working on inequality, segregation of cities, social mobility, et cetera, where clearly it's relevant for policy. At that point, I hadn't yet discovered, so to speak, my own interest in behavioral economics. That came a little bit later, but then that came together already with some interest in, the policy or the social implications.
Okay, great. So I want to switch gears a little bit. I'm co-teaching usually psychology for public policy, which is a 502 course for the MPA students. And 3 years ago, I was co-teaching it with Betsy Levy-Pollock. We invited Danny KAHNEMAN to give a lecture to those students. Students loved the lecture, but before we actually went in and introduced Danny to the students, Danny wanted to see the syllabus. So Danny is a person who actually was the person who put together this Psychology for Public Policy course back in 2003 together with Eldar. So it was probably 13 or 14 years later after he initiated this course that he saw the syllabus, and his reflection was, it's become so empirical. Back in the day, in 2003, when we were teaching this course, it was much more theoretical. We were talking about theory. We didn't have a lot of experiments to show to students, not even lab experiments. It's become so much more empirical. So now to turn it to you, my question is, did you experience that empirical type of shift from very theoretical to very empirical as you went about your research? And I guess more pointedly, I'm interested in, maybe you can talk about one particular empirical finding that you found to be groundbreaking for either your research or for the implication of behavioral science to policy. We started with Debbie, and we're going to shift that, and we're going to start with.
Okay. So I think there is some shift which is natural for a growing field to more empirical work. I took a look before this panel at one of our one leading conference in economics and behavioral, and that's hosted by Stanford. And there's definitely a trend of increasing fractions of more empirical papers. As for an important paper, I won't make a global statement, because if I say that one paper is important, by conclusion, you might think that I think others are not. But I'll mention one paper that really influenced me, which was Larry Ausubel's work on the credit card market. And I read that when I was finishing my graduate studies, and there are many interesting things about this work, but part of it is this identification of strange contracts that happen in this market. And by this, I mainly refer to teaser rate offers. So these are offers that you probably get in the mail where you have a low interest rate for a certain period of time and then a very high interest rate. And as a consequence, I also collected the ads that I received for many years, which led to one of the biggest data sets of spam mail ever created. But it made me think throughout my career about multiple questions. One was, what are the conditions of the market that would make consumers that are subject to some distortions? Say in this example, maybe they think that they'll repay their debt immediately, and in fact they don't. They think they'll switch credit cards, and in fact they don't. So what are the conditions of the markets that lead to their exploitation, that would make them worse off? So that was one question that I really tackled for a long time with. The other question comes from my interest in political economy. So you could think about politicians as firms like the banks. They cater to their consumers, who are the voters, and who ultimately decide whether or not to vote for them. And so looking at the credit card market, I immediately thought, well, what are conditions under which politicians will actually exploit voters who are subject to certain distortions in their decision making? When would politicians exploit or indulge these preferences? When would they come up with policies that are actually beneficial? So, you know, it's very nice to think about a benevolent planner, and if that's possible, that is fantastic. If we can just fix people up, that's great, and sometimes we can, and we know that there are many examples in which these sorts of policies have been incredibly successful, but sometimes we can't, and what happens then? And the last question that triggered for me is kind of, when should we expect these weird behaviors? So do we need to think of kind of strange psychology of people? Can they emerge just from groups making decisions together, for example, a household or a committee, et cetera? So this was very inspiring for me.
Thank you. Okay. So I've been interested in two main questions, and I'll mention a specific paper that lies at their intersection, but first I want to say a little bit about the two lines. So the two lines are first the interaction of multiple motivations for what we do, particularly things that have kind of moral or pro-social implications. For explaining human behavior, economists typically appeal to material incentives. Social psychologists like Debbie and others, focus more on things like social norms, peer influence, the meaning of the act, and so on. And one thing I'm interested is putting them all together, because in most situations, all of these things are present. There are material consequences to what you do. Other people are watching. You're also watching yourself and learning about yourself. So that's one interesting question to me, at least. The other one is what you might call self-deception, or sometimes called motivated reasoning, motivated thinking. And you can think of things like wishful thinking, denial of reality, not wanting to know, and so on. And I guess we can look around in the whole world and see that at work. And that's something that's very counter or unnatural, I would say, to standard economics. Even with enriched preferences, people usually are thought of wanting to fool others, but not to fool themselves. And these are cases where people may actually want to fool themselves. So coming to empirical work, yes, there's been more and more of empirical work, in particular because data is becoming cheap and abundant and so on. But I'll just mention two simple experiments that I thought were very insightful, and the one I want to focus on is the latter because it's less well known. So the first set were very well-known experiments by Ernst Fehr, who's at Zurich in the late 90s, early 2000s, who very beautifully demonstrated, the fact that people don't always behave selfishly, even when it's not a repeated interaction, even when it's anonymous interaction in kind of economically sensible environments that look like labor markets, et cetera. So that really convinced a lot of us that we should pay attention to what are now called these so-called social preferences, which we knew were there, but were a bit neglected. And then the view that emerged for a while was that, well, in the world, there are people who are completely selfish. Maybe they took an economics course. There are people who are very generous. There are people who are less generous. And there's a kind of a distribution of types. But of course, reality is more complicated because motivations are not just my self-interest, your self-interest. Things like self-image, identity, et cetera, come into place. So the paper that I thought was perhaps the most beautiful paper I've seen since some of Ernst Fehr's paper was a paper on so-called moral wiggle room that came out in the early 2000s, and that showed that the kind of altruistic or reciprocal behavior that Ernst Fehr and others documented is real, but it's also very fragile. And if people are given an opportunity to, in some sense, not face the fact that they're doing something selfish or immoral, they will take that opportunity. The simplest example is in the standard dictator game, which most of you know. In the standard dictator game, somebody is given $10 and they can split it however they want. with another person who's anonymous, they will never see them again, etc. And most people give. Most people give, therefore, they must have some social preferences. But in that paper, they showed that this is very fragile. For example, if you give people a choice between having $10 and sharing them just as they like with someone else, or just having $9 for themselves without the opportunity to share, many people will take the $9, okay? Which is really the most selfish thing, because you could have given $9 to yourself and another dollar to the other person, but that would be too explicit a choice where you would have to choose between your self-interest and your self-image. Whereas somehow taking the $9 allows you to delude yourself into not questioning your generosity. And they have other conditions in that very nice experiment where people, if they can ignore whether what's good for them is good for someone else or bad for someone else, they choose to ignore it and they behave selfishly, whereas when they know that it's bad for somebody else, then they feel compelled to give. So I thought this was very interesting because it showed that public goods provision, pro-social motivation, et cetera, is more complex than just generous types and less generous types. And it also showed the reality of self-deception or cognitive dissonance, et cetera, which are themes which I think were also out of fashion in psychology for a while, but are making a comeback there as well as in economics.
Thank you, Roland.
Well, the empirical study that got me into this field was a classic study by my former colleague, my now retired colleague, John Darley, and Bibb Latney in 1968. It was a classic study. It was old when I was young. It's older now. It was a very famous study on bystander intervention, basically showing that in emergency situations, the more people who are present to witness an emergency, the less likely any of them is to help. Many of you are nodding, so I'm sure that you've heard about this study. It's actually a set of studies, but any one study actually really makes the point. And it reflected, it was not policy-relevant research. I mean, it was policy-relevant research, but it certainly wasn't conceived that way at that time. I would describe it more as kind of social action research or problem-focused research, the kind of research that really defined not just my field, social psychology, but a lot of the social sciences in the post-World War II period. Coming out of World War II, there were a lot of burning questions on people's minds about the events that happened, right? About how obedience to authority could have produced the Holocaust, how good people stood by and did nothing, right? How the persuasion and propaganda machine of Nazi Germany was able to convince ordinary German citizens that what was going on was okay. So really the research agenda for the social sciences in that period was set by these events. And so the work wasn't policy, I mean, nobody was thinking about policies, right? But they were thinking about problems. They were thinking about social problems and how an understanding of psychology and understanding of economics and understanding of sociology, social structures could inform that. I was hooked immediately upon learning of this study. And I have to say, having taught social psychology to generations of Princeton students, a lot of people have gotten hooked on social psychology when they hear about this study. What's interesting is, so when we talk about policy-relevant basic research here at the Woodrow Wilson School, this is a perfect example of what we're talking about. Because it addresses a fundamental question about human behavior, about behavioral science. But the policy implications, although I have to say they went unexplored for a long time, are just a step away. And now, a couple of years ago, my 8-year-old daughter came home with, having participated in some kind of a intervention in her school. She came home with a bookmark that said, be an upstander, not a bystander, right? These bystander, the insights about bystander intervention now inform a lot of policies and a lot of interventions. For example, on this campus, and I think on many campuses, there are bystander intervention, bystander apathy-related interventions to address issues like date rape, for example, right? To address private behaviors where you can't address the behavior directly, but your best shot at reducing the prevalence of the behavior is to embolden the people the bystanders who might see it. So that's my pitch for behavioral science research and public policy.
So we're actually, I want to get to questions from the audience. So before we do that, I was planning on having all of you reflect on this question, but since we don't have a lot of time, and Debbie's the Dean of Faculty, maybe I thought about asking, how is it that we have this particular center here in Princeton? Could it have emerged anywhere at a different university? What's special about Princeton that made it possible for this center to be put together here?
Well, I can give my story and about the origin myth of this center, and then certainly Roland, who was here during that time too, could speak as well. I mean, for me, this center is a direct outcome of both the generosity and the ethos of the Woodrow Wilson School. You know, when the Woodrow Wilson School invested in this field before it was cool, really, and in a big way too. So this would have been, you know, several deans back. Mike Rothschild, when Danny Kahneman was hired, invested in having a presence for psychology, for behavioral science in the school. And created this course. Danny created this course, 502, and made it a required course for all MPA students. And that's a really significant move. So I think, you know, hiring in psychologists, the willingness to take a chance on a new venture was Danny, and then all the deans that have followed him up to CC have really given this venture incredible support. And I'm glad it's become cool, you know, but it might not have. And the other thing I would say is the ethos of the school also deserves note, because, you know, this is a policy school that is unusual in being tied to the disciplines, to the social science and behavioral science disciplines. Everybody in the school, virtually everybody in the school, has a cross appointment in one of the academic disciplines, and that sets it apart from many policy schools. I think that's been just enormously good for this particular enterprise, because it's enabled the center and the work around behavioral science and public policy to profit from advances occurring in the disciplines, in psychology, in economics, and in related fields, and to really be on the cutting edge, and I mean that quite genuinely, to be on the cutting edge of progress in applying and thinking about the implications of behavioral science findings for policy. So that's my story. Roland, you want to add?
A little bit maybe. So I know that, you know, a lot of work and effort and generosity goes into creating a center like this, but intellectually it feels very natural as an outgrowth of the way we operate in the Woodrow Wilson School. So many of us economists know our psychology colleagues and vice versa. We know them personally, we know their work. They attend some of our seminars, we attend some of their seminars. There are sometimes joint seminars organized across disciplines explicitly. And so these boundaries, in some sense, have been, these boundaries, you know, which do exist, obviously, you know, are almost invisible or much less visible thanks to the way the Woodrow Wilson School is organized and the primacy that is given to research. And so this center feels like a very natural outgrowth of it. And no, I don't think it could have happened somewhere else.
Okay. I would like to ask you to join me in thanking the speakers, and we're going to take questions. So I was asked to say that we want to prioritize the students at Woodrow Wilson in terms of asking questions. So if you have a question, just step here at the microphone and we're going to take your questions. I would also want to instruct you to if you have a question, just point or say who the question is directed to, or if it's directed to the whole panel. Okay?
Hello.
Hello.
Hi, I guess this will be a general interest question, and I'd be interested to hear everyone's thoughts. But I want to preface it by saying I'm so excited to be here because I was in that 502 class 3 years ago when Betsy and Alan were teaching it, and we had Danny KAHNEMAN come in. With no offense to Professor Benabou, whose macroeconomics course was also transformational, I think 502 was kind of rocked my world and sort of changed the way I see things. And I'm coming back after 2 years out in the professional world, and I took a lot of little nuggets with me from 502. For anyone who's taken it, you can sort of hack your own life with all these behavioral fixes. One of my favorites, was called the power pose. We learned that if you strike a broad-shouldered stance for 15 seconds, you then increase your performance on any number of activities. So, I took that with me, and over the past 2 years, anytime I went into an interview, I would strike a power pose and feel good about myself. But last week on the radio, I heard that one of the lead proponents of this theory, you might be familiar with this, has since said it doesn't, no longer meets the standards of evidence that we would need or would apply to make causal statements about the power pose. And this raises, in my mind, a lot of questions, I think, for the field right now, especially as it moves from theory towards, in empirical research, especially empirical research that's intended to inform policy. And so, my example is trivial, obviously, so I was an idiot for striking a power pose every time I went into an interview, maybe. But I think a lot of this research does purport to have bigger impacts on people's lives. And so my question is, do we need to hold, policy-intended research to a higher evidentiary standard if we do, want to actually use it to shape how we set up policies as important as, access to credit or, healthcare, nutrition? Thanks.
Very important question. Who wants to take it? A very difficult question as well, I would say. I guess
I'll just answer yes. We should hold it to a higher standard, and that's why there is science and policy, and sometimes it takes a while, and sometimes it should take a while before science is translated into policy, and sometimes because of the media, because of foundations, etc., it goes too fast. And this is not specific to this area. We see it in medicine. We see it in many other areas.
I can say, oh.
If I can ask a follow-up. So then should we I'm very excited about behavioral science, and as an aspiring policymaker, I think I can use it. But do we need to kind of restrain ourselves a bit and restrain our enthusiasm and maybe wait for some of these findings that we're very excited about because we think they can help people? Do we need to temper that with the acknowledgement that, a lot of this was maybe developed when it was much more theoretical, or we didn't have access to a big enough experiment to really have enough confidence to run with it?
I've said my piece.
Yeah. Well, first of all, I want to say that if power poses make you feel great, then continue doing them. But beyond that, I think, certainly I agree with Roland that we need, we probably need a very harsh standard before we implement something that we see in the lab. But I think we actually probably need to rethink how we do replications and how we design experiments. And let me put a few thoughts out there that are not fully organized, but the first thought is that actually I think matters might be much worse than what we are seeing right now. And so this is the negative, the negative thing that I'll say. Because I think experimenters not only have some leeway in how they analyze their results, but also in how they design the experiment. So today, most of the replication exercises just replicate the experiment as it was done. But to the extent that we choose the phrasing of the instructions, the precise parameters of the problem, the exact game that we play, that might affect results as well. So that might suggest that a lot of results that we know, even if they replicate using the current ways of replications, they're not very robust. And this is a real problem with the emergence of online platforms for experimentation. Because right now, running an experiment with 1,000 people is really easy. I can put it on mTurk and I'll get all the data within a day. So, in principle, I could try all sorts of variations, and that's very dangerous. So the positive take on it is that I think there is a way out, and in fact, in other fields have used it, where you submit, before you run your experiment, you submit your design, you submit exactly how you analyze the data, and then you run it and report the data. So this is submitted to some centralized institute, and that is kind of my positive take on the suggestions of a direction to go.
Yeah, and that's happening much more in psychology. I mean, what psychology is going through right now is a kind of the growing pains of being taken seriously, right? Where it's making people realize that we've got to be much more rigorous in the way that we collect and analyze our data, that replication is important, that making data publicly available and sharing data is much more important. And all of that is now happening, albeit in some fits and starts and with some drama around it. But I think that's the field coming to grips with its growing influence, I think.
And what I would add to that is I think it's a sign of maturity in a field to actually reflect on our practices and make them better, hold them to a higher standards. And I think you're right in terms of applying them to policy. They need to be very strong findings before we move in that direction, rather than just stepping on the whatever is currently fad. We need a little bit of time to actually solidify the finding, and in order for us to apply it properly to policy. Are there other questions in the audience? Yeah.
Thank you for the great discussions. This is a general question again. I'm a PhD here working on climate change, so we're talking about this long-term risks that we know that human beings are really bad at perceive. So my question is, given that we know this is a fact, that there is always a misperception of risk, and things like climate change is really hard for general people to understand what you should do today to change your behavior. I'm wondering if this is a justification for stronger policy intervention, such as for government to take a stronger role in regulating things, rather than giving this flexibility to choose to regular people, let them to make the decision that may end up being not the best decision for themselves.
I think it's a very interesting question. Libertarian paternalism, which I think is going to come up in the next panel more forcefully. I guess we can take the question if you want to, but this particular question, I think it's very much aligned with what the next panel is going to discuss.
I'll just say that the government might not always be the one that you're hoping it is, and what they do with respect to climate change might not always be what is scientifically desirable. So it's important that individuals or groups or NGOs also have levers of action to compensate for potential government failures, just like for market failures.
Okay. Any other questions? Oh, we have a taker. It better be good because we waited for so long.
So what are the interesting research questions that are coming up now because of the Brexit campaign and the mind-blowing Trump campaign?
Are you striking a power pose?
Yes.
Yeah, I'm just wondering, how have these campaigns shifted your thinking about your own research? Because people are really voting against their own interests in mind-blowing numbers.
I think it's a bit too soon, so we need to let the dust settle. So, science moves very slowly. I will take one tidbit that I found interesting. you know, traditionally we thought, so I'll go back to polls. Traditionally, we really believed in electronic markets, and we thought those are fantastic things. They have failed miserably in these elections, both on Brexit and actually on our own elections. So, in fact, when you looked at the electronic markets during the primaries, they violated Bayes' rule.
Do you mean a prediction market?
The prediction markets. So it's interesting to understand why that is, especially given that this is viewed as a great instrument for aggregating information, and this is kind of a prime example for this. And to the extent that information actually feeds on turnout and what people think and want, this is very important.
I'm actually not a student, but I still think I am, particularly in the hallowed walls of Princeton. Actually, following up on that, it actually goes a bit to what Professor Prentice said. You know, I live in Britain, although my accent would belie that. And what was quite interesting, it's almost like this concept of, in an emergency, people tend to act less. So what happened was, it seemed in Brexit, is that the actual young people who were clearly in favor of Remain, when they thought that Remain was going to pass, particularly with the very sad occurrence of the murder of one of the MPs, they just didn't vote. So it's a bit along those lines. But to have a kind of a follow-up question on that, if you look at the world today, I would say one of the most challenging issues is the question of income inequality. And I think that actually explains, to some extent, the very negative behavioral change in terms of the splintering of the political process, because you see that now virtually everywhere. The last place you would think you would see it is in the US, but you see it. Obviously, you see it in Britain. You probably could see it in France. You might see it in Italy. So it's actually, you're seeing it a bit in Germany. So it's actually very disquieting. So I guess the question is, it seems like the real question to stop this negative behavioral change is an attempt to use public policy to solve the question of income inequality. And that might have to do, to a certain extent, with altruism, because the rich kind of have to sacrifice, but they don't seem to necessarily want to. So I was just wondering if anybody had an opinion on that, although it might be more for the next panel, but I thought I'd ask it anyway because I was right next to the microphone.
Thank you. Do you have thoughts on that?
Well, I mean, first going back one step, I mentioned before things like motivated beliefs, wishful thinking, conspiracy theories, etc. So the current events have reinforced me in the view that these are psychologically, politically, and important phenomena and that we should study them. I don't think that most of that research is yet at the point of making policy recommendations, but there is a lot of it going on now, both theoretically and experimentally and with real data. And I do think, coming to the question, that some of it is linked to rising inequality. It is when people either are hurting in absolute terms or in relative terms, they see this gap opening, then they find they want both culprits to blame and they want reasons to hope for something better, which may or may not exist, and then they're inclined to behave in false promises and false conspiracies.
Yeah, what I would say in connection with, I mean, putting these two questions together, I think, and again, you know, just as the post-World War II period provided a whole agenda of questions that seemed very pressing for social science to answer, I think the current moment does as well. And you know, I wouldn't, my own questions wouldn't be about income inequality so much as they would be about what gets expressed in the public sphere and then what gets inferred from that. I'm very interested in public opinion and voice and the expression, you know, so, you know, sexism, for example, as, you know, what is allowable to say about women versus men, right? And then what gets affirmed when it is spoken or written, and then what is inferred about our society from that. I mean, those are the kinds of questions. There are phenomena like spirals of silence and pluralistic ignorance, that's what I've actually spent my career studying, that are distortions that come from the biases in what gets said, what is sayable, right? What is expressible and what is not. So for me, this particular, this campaign and Brexit is, a sort of extreme and shocking outcome of exactly that, right? As you say, for me, that's the agenda that comes to the fore when I look at what's out there now, given my own interest. But I think there are some fascinating questions about income inequality. There's some great work being done here about, the men, right? The underemployed, lower income men and their negative health outcomes and what's happened to that population of people, right? So I think there's fertile ground here for a lot of research to be done.
Okay, so please join me in thanking the speakers again. We're going to